how to write an ISO 27001 compliant information security policy. This brief video is part of an information security training program. It explains how to write an ISO 27001 compliant information security policy. We go through a sample ISO 27001 information security policy, and you're free to download and edit the policy for your needs. One of the key documents required by ISO 27001, the international standard for information security, is the information security policy. The policy defines at a high level your approach to information security and documents both why you are doing this as well as how you are going to do it. The detail, or the what, you specifically do is left for the individual implementation. There's nothing to stop you, however, adding the implementation details to the policy if you want to edit fewer documents, and we'll look at that as we go through. It's important to remember that this is your policy for your business and must meet your requirements. There are some aspects that the auditor will absolutely want to see, but you are largely free to write what you like at whatever level of detail you want. When writing your policy, you need to consider your audience and your stakeholders. Policies are best thought of as being above-the-line policies and below-the-line policies. The above-the-line policies are the end user, acceptable use policies, the clear desk policy, the password policy, etc. The below-the-line policies are the information security policy, the encryption policy, access policy, and the rest. These are the policies that are only going to be read by IT staff, subject matter specialists, and auditors, whereas the above-the-line policies are read by the end users. By and large, the auditors are not going to read the detail. They ask, is there a policy and was it recently edited? And that's all. So the most important aspects are the date and the title, but it's worth thinking for one moment about the stakeholders. So the stakeholders include the IT and other subject matter experts. So these are the people that need to know what to do. The policy is good, but they really need to know, do I need a firewall? So a policy that simply states enforced least privilege isn't much help. So you need to put the scenarios for firewalls and other controls into the policy. But in practice, if you have anything other than a trivial network, it soon gets very complicated. So it's usually best to split the guidance into the specific areas. Otherwise, you have to start talking about all the possible permutations of various operating systems, desktops, software, etc. The information security policy is not about instructions for users. That's the acceptable use policy. That's the InfoSec equivalent of the expenses policy. The InfoSec policy is more like the overall finance policy. Auditors are the second set of stakeholders. Auditors want you to have a policy. They will look for specific areas, but they won't normally care about the detail. They'll care about the headings. So we'll look at the headings and we'll look at the detail in the sample policy. This sample policy is deliberately simple, but at the same time it's sufficient to get you through ISO 27001. Now you can be as complicated or as prescriptive as you like. If you want to keep it simple, then a policy such as this will be perfect. When writing your policy, make sure you read the ISO standards first and use the ISO standard words. The auditors will never disagree if you quote the ISO standard back at them. In the actual ISO audit, the auditor is quite likely to have a copy of the standard with them and to check that what you do is what the standard says. So it does no harm to simply parrot the words from the standard. So let's look at the detail. First, we have the title. You need to say who approves it. You need to have a version history that shows you have reviewed the policy every year, and it's just easier to review every year rather than try to argue that the policy doesn't need to be reviewed annually. And make sure you've stated who initially approved the policy and that you have delegated authority to make subsequent changes. Your auditors will pick you up on this if you don't. State who wrote it and state that the policy is available for all staff. State that violations of the policy must be reported. Note, you're not saying what happens when violations are reported, only that the policy is that violations must be reported. Now, let's start with the actual policy. First, define the scope. And what you want is a Goldilocks scope, not too broad, not too tight. Put in enough in the scope to make it meaningful, but not too much to make it too broad that you end up with implementation difficulties. And remember that although the ISO auditor will prefer that the entire company is in scope, you can just certify a business unit or a service if that's what you want. State your objectives. You can be vague, but refer to the standard and use words from the standard. Next, I like to have definitions. It's good to state what information security is. Auditors like this too. Use the ISO standard definitions. If your company's definitions are different, then provide a mapping to the ISO standard so that you can head off any observations or recommendations for improvement. Context. Here you want to just document what the marketing people say. Refer to your company website, keep it simple. You have to document your internal and external issues. These will depend on your organization, so be creative about the issues and the stakeholders. Your ISO auditors will want to know that you have taken internal stakeholders and external stakeholders into account. The next section is management and leadership commitment. This is one of the most important aspects of the policy. You need to demonstrate management commitment, so put in some of the standard ISO boilerplate and put in whatever it is that your leadership has done to demonstrate that this is important. For example, your leader might have sent an email to all staff, or they might have asked you to present at their board, or they might have simply paid for the program. Whatever it is, put that into the statement. Your auditor will normally want to speak to the person that you quote here, so keep that in mind when you're writing this section. The next few pages are the meat of the policy. You'll see that the policy follows the ISO headings. This means that you can state that the policy is fully ISO compliant, as you have covered all of the ISO controls, and we'll look at those turn by turn. The first item is the risk assessment policy. The risk assessment policy defines how risks will be assessed, documented, and managed. The detail of the process is recorded in the process document, but at this point we say that there must be an assessment and we must document the outcome of the assessment and the risks. We need to say that we have a risk appetite. We document the risk appetite policy and set the policy for risk appetite at such a level that it is fit for your business and also allows you as the information security manager to act on risks that are identified. The next section is the information security organization, where you have to say that the organization of the business has taken into account principles of least privilege, separation of duties. You can also say that you will maintain contact with authorities and special interest groups wherever that is meaningful and possible. The special interest groups can be covered by your personal membership of professional bodies, or it can be if your organisation has signed up to free open source intelligence alerts, or perhaps you're a member of a trade organisation and can receive third-party intelligence and risk data and and intelligence data, then you can make an observation for that here. We can then go through the policies. The mobile device policy is very simple. The auditor is looking for a concise policy that goes into the detail of how your mobile devices are to be controlled, or if mobile devices are not considered to be a specific case, simply say that the company's mobile device policy is that all policies apply to all devices, including mobile devices. And you can take a similar approach with the teleworking policy. You have to have the teleworking policy, and the teleworking policy can be that all policies, in other words the information security policy, applies to all locations, including teleworking sites, so that you don't have to have specific policies for people who, for instance, work from home or work from a remote site, or happen to choose to work from a restaurant, coffee bar, etc. Human resources security policy. The ISO standard requires that you consider the risks introduced by staff. In practice, the ISO auditor just wants you to have vetted your staff and made sure that you have looked into the past behaviours of staff. If your organisation does this, you should say so. If it does not, then you'll need to construct your risk assessment to justify why this control is required at the level to which you implement it. In private, ISO auditors will understand and agree that a narrative of previous behaviour does not necessarily indicate future behaviour. But they still will ask that you have undertaken checks, and at the very least they will ask that you have undertaken the right to work within a jurisdiction. But bear in mind, of course, that all of your HR policies have to be compliant with the local legislation. The next item is the asset management policy. The asset management policy really should say that you document your assets, you record the assets at the appropriate level of abstraction, and within this policy the level of abstraction is the system, and I recommend that you abstract your policies to system level or business level or building level or staff level, rather than attempt to record policies at the level of server, workstation, etc. If you try to record it at the level of workstation, then you will be in a never-ending catch-up as workstations change, and you will be asked to demonstrate compliance of an asset management for IT systems that you may well not have control of. Asset disposal policy. You need to ensure that you document that the policy for the organisation is that assets must be securely deleted. Ideally, you will have a secure erasure or physical disposal process, and you can document that as the policy, or if not, you can say that you must have an appropriate measure which includes shredding, and you could have it in your process that where people work in a remote site, for example, they can take paper to an office location for physical shredding. Information classification policy. The information classification policy requires that information within your organization is appropriately classified. The auditor really wants to see every document labeled with the information classification for your business. If you have the power to do that, if you can force all staff to label all documents at all times, and if you are able to take disciplinary action against staff who do not, then by all means have an information classification policy that requires labeling and goes into a level of detail that perhaps includes client data, internal data, financial data, data that should be encrypted, data that does not have to be encrypted, data that is public. That is perfectly valid. However, it is also perfectly valid to have a very simple policy, which is that documentation is always internal use only, unless it is obvious that it is not. And the auditor won't love this, but they will accept that that is the case, and they will also accept that it's not always possible to document the policy or to label the policy on a document. Sometimes the documents have to be unlabeled. And providing your policy allows for this, this means that you will not get a non-conformity the first time your auditor finds a document that doesn't have the information classification written on it. The media handling policy feels like a throwback to a different time. The risks to corporate data could be derived through disposable media. In practice, there is likely to come through network attached storage and third-party file systems, but the standard has the requirement for media handling. So you need to make a statement to say that removable media should not be used, but if it is, adequately protect it. And then you're not going to fail the audit the first time they find a manager using a USB drive. Clearly, good practice is that you don't want people to use USB drives, but the task here is as much to enforce good practice as it is to ensure that our certification is successful. Access control policy. The access control policy is simple, that only staff with a need to know have access to systems, and those systems are based on the principles of least privilege. State also that access must be via a unique user ID, and that access accounts must be suspended when staff leave or third parties do not require access. If your business has more details or a more complicated access control or more user administration and a user life cycle, then by all means include it. But keep the rule when writing the policies is to keep it simple. Cryptographic policy. The cryptographic policy is simply that suitable encryption is used. Don't try to go into more detail. Key management policy. The key management policy is that suitable controls are in place. Now, you may get audited about the specific controls that are in place for specific keys. So you will need to know the keys that are managed, the keys that are kept, how they're processed, and where keys are stored, and you might have your keys, the passphrases to important systems, in a spreadsheet. You might have them in a book. You might have them in an online, non-repudiable electronic database. Whatever your organization chooses to do, but your policy can be very simple. Your physical security policy. Your physical security policy is simply that locations must be accessible to authorized people, control staff, and consider environmental threats, as the ISO standard requires that you do. The requirement for controls for environmental threats is part of the Annex A controls, which you can ignore if your risk assessment says that you need to do so. So, for example, if all of your assets are in cloud-based IaaS, then you may decide that physical security is not required. But if it is required, keep it simple and use the paragraph we've just seen. Operations security policy. The operational security policy is simply that information security should be included in business operations. Business operations are owned by the business operations function, and the policy is that information security is included in them. And you will have to ensure that this is the case and potentially edit existing business operations processes to give them an information security heading, and that heading can be as detailed or as lightweight and superficial as you wish to make it. Your malware protection policy. Simply say that workstations and servers must have appropriate anti-malware. You don't need to go into the details of which AV you're using. It is highly likely that your AV will change within the life cycle of an ISMS, so you don't need to put the details unless you consider that to be appropriate, and unless you want to ensure that a specific variant of AV is used within the organization and you want to include it at the policy level. Your backup policy, and your backup policy is that backups must be taken. Your logging and monitoring policy. Now, ISO has a lot to say when it comes to logging. The ISO 27002 standard has a lot of very good practice and good guidance, and if you are working in a government environment, the government contracts and the government requirements will include extensive logging and monitoring. However, for the terms of the policy, in order to ensure that your organization meets the spirit and the letter of ISO 27001 and allows you to operate your ISMS effectively, I suggest that you keep it simple. Your logging policy is that systems must create log files. Your log files should be kept for a minimum of whatever your organization can keep log files for, 6 months if you can. Say that your system clocks should be synchronized. In practice, your system clocks will be synchronized through NTP, and it makes life really difficult if you don't synchronize your clocks. So it's worth including the requirement for clock synchronization in your policy, and that privileged user access should be logged, and if you can, have an immutable log storage for privileged user actions. Operational software control policy. So the policy for the corporation is that users must not install prohibited software, which means that it is possible for a user to install software provided that they have approval. And note, the policy doesn't say that the approval has to be given by a specific individual, only that the users need to have approval to install software. The network communication security policy is simply that the networks must be segregated using appropriate security controls. Again, we're using appropriate, we're using weasel words. We want to ensure that we balance the two requirements for firstly having an information security policy that genuinely allows you to have a strong, secure environment, and also allows you to pass the ISO audit, your third-party access policy. The access policy is that information security policies apply to third parties. And here you can say that third-party access must be risk assessed, and access must be applied with least privilege, need-to-know principles enforced, and remote access should be off by default and enabled under change control, which is good practice and a change management process that should be relatively easy to provide evidence for. Information transfer policy. The policy for the corporation is that agreements such as contracts must be in place when data is transferred outside of the corporation. The construction of the agreements and contracts is wholly down to the legal or commercial part of the organization. Systems acquisition, development and maintenance policy. So the maintenance policy acquisition is that application development should follow a secure software development lifecycle. That lifecycle applies to software that is developed by your organization, but it doesn't necessarily have to apply to software that is configured by your organization. So it's very important that you are able to draw the distinction between true software development and ad hoc configuration, given of course that some configuration is very close to software development. You can require that bespoke software developed for the corporation must follow a secure software development lifecycle, but you don't need to say that all third-party software that is procured must have been developed using a secure software development lifecycle. And you can also say that you can use open source software, for example, where perhaps it is known that there is no formal secure development lifecycle. It's worth stating that changes must be controlled under change control. You should state that test data is carefully selected and protected, and you can say that systems must be patched. The ISO standard doesn't mandate the frequency of patching, and if you wish you can simply say that patching can be implemented in a regime that is timely. Your supplier relationships policy says that the information security policy applies to suppliers. Suppliers should be risk assessed and assured, and security requirements should be agreed and documented, and suppliers should be monitored. And that is normally a requirement that you can flow down to your supplier management team. Information security incident management policy. So the policy for security incidents is that all incidents, including real and suspected incidents, must be reported to management. And that then flows through to management, such that management have got to report to their management, and you can state that ultimately all reports have to come through to the security office. For real incidents, it's worth stating that root cause analysis should be undertaken, and you will need to demonstrate root cause analysis anyway to get through the ISO standard, so you might as well put it into the policy. And where necessary, you can consider forensic analysis through an internal forensics team or possibly through a third party. Information security business continuity policy. Business continuity is a function of the business. It is not an IT function, it's not an information security function. The ISO standard requires that business continuity includes requirements for information security. So one good practice here is to take the existing business continuity plan and to ask or to edit and to insert into that a section on information security and to put into that section that the information security policy applies. And that will demonstrate the link. Finally, we have the compliance policy. The compliance policy is that all legal and contractual requirements must be met, which of course is obvious. No business would want to state that it is not going to meet legal and contractual requirements. We can state that records must be protected from loss, and we can state what the ISO standard requires us to do, to say that the approach to information security must be reviewed periodically and their records must be kept for however long records must be kept. So that is the overall information security policy. It is a short, it is concise, and it is a high-level set of statements about how the organization will implement information security, how it will keep its data assets secure, and how it will meet its obligations that are due to stakeholders and all interested parties.